No, so that I think looks like we are kicked off and ready to go. So thank you very much, Erin, for coming to join us on this webinar with Connolly's Red Mills and Eventing Ireland. It's always nice, particularly at this stage of the season, to be able to take a couple of minutes to have a look back at the season that has been, how we can get our horses ready for that 2025 season, and then obviously to look ahead. So I don't think there's much point in hanging around. We'll be able to just get straight into it. So Erin, the eventing season is done and lots of horses have been turned out, or they're gone out for a break of some form, or they're winding down for the winter. What would you say is the best way to support your horse with this change in their routine?
Yeah, so I think now is really the perfect time where you can kind of take that bit of a chance to step back, take a breather, have a look at everything, reflect on how your season has gone, and maybe if there's anything you need to tweak before next season, and make those changes throughout the winter if it is feed related or energy related or anything like that. But specifically coming into winter, there are a few things that just should be considered really, in terms of supporting them throughout that change in weather, change in conditions, changes in the grass, all that kind of stuff. We're very lucky at the minute, it's still very mild, so there is still a bit of grass around, whereas this time last year it probably wasn't as good. So you might get them extra few weeks in the fields this year, a bit longer than previously. Something that is really important is forage, obviously. So whether that's grass, hay, haylage, wherever that source of forage might be coming from, it's important to make sure that they firstly have enough of it, but also that it's of good enough quality. So as the weather starts to get a bit colder and the winter becomes closer, the quality of nutrition in that grass will decline, at which stage then you need to think about substituting with something like hay or haylage, whatever might be available to you, and whichever one might be better quality from a nutrition perspective. And so I would say that's top priority really coming into the winter, is making sure they have enough forage and good quality forage. Go ahead. You're gonna ask something?
I was just going to say, with them being out over the winter, like how important is it to make sure you're getting rugs off? You're keeping an eye, because forage, obviously, the amount you're feeding is so dependent on their body condition.
Yeah, so taking them off and having a look at them is huge. Body weight is one indicator of obviously, where your horse is at, but like it's very difficult to measure. Not everyone has a weighing scale, obviously. Weight tapes can be beneficial in some ways, but really the most important thing for you as any individual is standing back and taking a look at your horse. So looking at body condition scoring. We have a lot of stuff on our website about body condition scoring, how each individual can do it, what you're looking for, looking at the 3 different sections, where they might be at. So taking those rugs off at different stages quite routinely, and making sure that you haven't left them out in the field for weeks, and then all of a sudden you go out and you think, oh, I must take a look at them. You take the rugs off and you think, oh God, they've wasted away a little bit on me, or they've really lost weight all of a sudden. That's when you're behind the bridle yourself and you're trying to play catch up, and you're like, oh God, now I need to feed them. And then people panic and they feed them loads, and then you have more risk factors involved in that. So making sure they've access to forage, taking the rugs off regularly, and taking into consideration what type of turnout you have, what type, like how good the grass might be. That obviously is weather dependent as much as where you're located. What other kind of access you need to provide, in terms of they always need to have obviously clean fresh water as well in turnout paddocks, and just making sure that you don't throw them out into the paddock and forget about them. They still need attention. They still need to be looked at regularly and check that they're not dropping off in weight or anything as the winter progresses.
And a particular thing with that body condition scoring, it is getting hands-on, isn't it? Because I know, like my mare, if you were to look at her, sometimes the way her coat goes, you get a fright. And then actually, when you've hands-on, it's just how her winter coat grows. It can be a little bit funny.
Yeah, you need to really palpate the certain areas. And with their coats being that little bit thicker, or some of them might be clipped or not clipped, making sure that you can't feel those ribs too easily. Even if they have a furry coat and you can't visibly see them, if you can feel them very easily, that's another indicator. It's not just that you can see them very visibly, because they're obviously not as easy to see if they have a thicker coat, if they haven't been clipped or something. And also, like, you know, the fatty cresty necks, you just need to check everything with your eyes and your hands, and really take a step back and try and look at it objectively.
So if, let's say, you have a horse that can tend to be a fizzier type, might be more restricted in their turnout now, so mightn't be getting as much energy out, being able to play around in the field, but equally tends to drop away, how would you go about feeding them if forage isn't enough?
So generally, as well, another point on forage not being enough with those fizzier types, it often isn't, because they're stressing, they're anxious, they're all over the place, they're busy bees. They'll generally utilize a lot more stores, as in that sense, as much as anything else. So you really have to take into consideration each horse as an individual. So if you have a fizzy type but also tends to lose condition, a lot of people are afraid to feed them. But really what you need to look at is the type of energy sources you're providing them with. You can feed them safely without driving them mad. So what you need to think about really is plenty of fiber. So again, that forage aspect. If they're in smaller turnout paddocks, fine, give them some hay. If you're worried about the energy content of hay or sugar content or anything like that, you can soak your hay and run off the water. That'll get rid of some of the sugars. And then when it comes to hard feed, you want to look at a low starch feed. Low starch feeds will always be matched with high fiber, high fat. So they're getting energy sources, they're just getting them in different proportions. So you want really something like, for example, our Horse Care Ultra is very low in starch, but it's a conditioning feed at the same time. So with them losing the weight, you can help support that with a conditioning feed, but also maintain a low starch diet that you're not going to have that fizz. Similarly, we've now launched our new product, the Horse Care Mash, and that is a great product, especially now coming into winter. So it is also a low starch product, but really conditioning. But also coming into winter, a mash is really lovely for horses to get in the evenings on a cold winter evening. A nice warm mash, quite conditioning. They get everything they need from it. It's a complete feed. They'll get all their vitamins and minerals, everything they need in that. Safe for your horses that are prone to laminitis, horses that have had or may have ulcers, all those types of conditions and issues, as well as your temperament issues. The new Care Mash would be great for that as well.
It is actually, it's a really, I love being able to give a warm mash, and the Care Mash, it soaks in 15 minutes. So it's not, you know, sometimes you're waiting around for mashes. Like we literally do it, put on your mash, clean out stables, come back, mash is done. So it is a really convenient one on that. Now, let's go to the opposite end of the scale. You have a pony that tends to be a little bit on the chunkier side. I know a lot of people will be eventing Connemara's and similar breeds. How do you manage them over winter, particularly the ones who can seem to get fat on air?
Yeah, there are both ends of the scales, obviously, and that's where again it comes down to treating them as individuals, and feeding them appropriately. So something like Care Mash or Ultra probably wouldn't be what you'd go for in that kind of a case. If you've something that puts on weight quite quickly, is a really good doer, what you really want to do is you want to reduce the calories, but you want to make sure that they're getting the nutrients they need. So really, in that sense, it comes down to things like balancer. So either of our balancers would be appropriate, the Grow Care or the Performa Care balancer. And really what that does is it gives you some quality protein and some vitamins and minerals, all the vitamins and minerals that they need, to fulfill nutrient requirements without getting those calories. So you're not getting that density in terms of your what we would call your standard complete feed. So the likes of your Ultra, where you feed by the scoop, you're getting that bulk, you're getting the calories. Balancers you feed in much smaller quantities, and they have a lower energy content. So you're not getting the same from each. you'd be increasing calories with Ultra, reducing calories with Balancer. So that's where if you have both of them there, you have both options. And also with the nutrient content in your grass declining in the winter, you need to consider that they're not getting all those vitamins and minerals from the grass anymore. So they will need a bit of Balancer to tide them over and keep fulfilling everything throughout the winter.
So then when it comes to supplements, can you just, you put your horse out, you just take them off all supplements? Is there some scenarios where actually supplement might be helpful? Or does it kind of depend on the supplement, really?
It depends on the supplement. It's very specific to, you really need to think about, if you sit down and look at, and there's 5 supplements in your feed room, you need to sit down and think, why am I using this? Why am I using this? Why am I using this? So if it's something for gut health, for example, that's a long-term product. That's something that I wouldn't be stopping with, and I would continue throughout, because it takes a long time for any sort of changes to happen in the gut. And if you've used a product, say for example, like the Foran NutriGuard, to help improve the gut environment, those changes happen very slowly over a period of time. So if you're going to take them off that and then start again, you're starting from scratch. So something that's a long-term product like NutriGuard, I would leave them on. If you're using something like, say, or pre-fuel product, that's more for competition and giving energy, and it's specific short-term use, then you don't need to be using things like that if you're not having that level of exercise. If it's something like any sort of hoof product, again, there's very slow turnover with anything to do with the feet. Those minerals will need to be maintained throughout the winter. So that's the kind of product you'd leave them on. It's very specific to the product, but you also need to think about why, first of all, why you're giving it. And second of all, what your horse is then doing throughout the winter. So if they're being turned out and they're doing absolutely nothing, you don't want to undo your good work that you've done with the gut. So you want to keep using something like that. But if they're doing nothing in the fields, they're not going to need daily electrolytes. So it's really specific to what your horse is doing and why you're using the product. If you're not sure, obviously you can use our Ask the Expert forums on our website to contact us and say, look, I'm using X, Y, and Z supplements. I'm not really sure if I should keep using them or not. One of us in the team will get back to you. We'll give you some advice if you're not sure yourself. So I think sitting down and having a look at it and planning before you enter the winter is key, really.
Closer to December, and people are starting to think about taking their horses back in from the field and back into doing a little bit of work. When it comes to feeding, do you start feeding for the work you're going to do with them, or are you feeding for the work you've already done?
So at any point in time, you should always feed to suit exercise. So that's currently, that's not what you did last week, what you will be doing next week. You feed to what you're doing right now. So if I'm sat on this chair all day and don't move at all, I don't need as much feed as if I was going out and training for a marathon every day. And it is specific to what you're doing at that current time. So as you start to bring your horse back into work, you can start to increase feed appropriately, not too quickly, not too suddenly. You want to build it as you can. So build it alongside, you're going to build your work up slowly. The same way you're not going to take them out of the field the first day and take them off for a gallop. You're 4 scoops a day.
If you are in a situation where you're bringing your horses in and you're kind of looking at using maybe Define and Shine or your Muscle Prep or a similar product, is it like, when do you start using those?
Really in line, you need to kind of line both your nutrition program up with your exercise program, really. So like we were saying about, feeding to suit exercise, you're going to plan a program in terms of exercise and fitness and building muscle and all that kind of stuff. And you're going to do that progressively over a number of weeks before you're going to be fit enough for your first event. So what you want to do is, as you build your program with exercise, you would build your program with nutrition. So the first few weeks of your horse coming back into work, a lot of it generally will be your slower work, and you'll be maybe doing a good bit of lunging first, and you'll be looking at kind of slowly building everything up. So at that stage, you'll be introducing your hard feed again because they'll be back into work, but you won't be feeding huge amounts of feed yet because they won't be doing loads of exercise. But with them first number of weeks, most likely being about, potentially losing a little bit of winter weight, but also building muscle, you would then introduce those types of products at the start. So as you start exercising, if you want to build top line, something like muscle prep is appropriate. Where you need to think about what products to use is if you have two issues. So if you need to lose weight from the winter, but you also want to build top line, then something like Define and Shine might not be appropriate because that's quite conditioning as well as helping with top line. So if you've come out of the winter and you're a little bit lower on the body condition score and you need to put on a bit of weight and build top line, Define and Shine is appropriate. If you don't want the weight, but you want to help build muscle, muscle prep would be more appropriate. So with those types of products, I would start using them as you start to build your exercise program. But I wouldn't be looking at using loads of something like Define and Shine straight away, because what you don't want to do is put on loads of weight very quickly. You would introduce something like Define and Shine very gradually. So you mightn't feed the full feeding rate at the very start. You might, feed half of it for the first couple of weeks and gradually build it up as you build your program alongside that.
And then what would be the difference between muscle prep and muscle max then? Like the muscle prep is the builder, isn't it?
Yeah, so muscle prep, think about them first stages where you're prepping your horse for competition or exercise or whatever you're going to do with it. Preparing for what you need, you're trying to build the muscle with muscle prep. Muscle max is more about muscle recovery and that turnover of everything to keep everything tipping along after exercise. So really muscle prep is building muscle, muscle max is muscle health. So if you've something that's prone to tying up a little bit, or something that's particularly stiff and they need that bit of a support from a muscle health point of view, muscle max is what you'd go for, whereas muscle prep is your building muscle.
And then if you have, say, a young horse that might be kind of coming into work, maybe for the first time, or might have done very light work in the past, what would your priorities be from a nutrition perspective to try and support them? Because obviously you want their first season out to be as successful as it can be.
Yeah, and with your younger horses as well, obviously they're learning everything for the first time as they go. So what you don't want to do is blow their brains, because you want them to take everything in. You want them to learn through every stage and mature from a mental perspective as much as physically as they go through their season. So for your younger horses, generally, now obviously every individual can be different, but generally for your younger horses, you're again going to look at those lower starch type feeds, because you're going to want to support them and give them the energy they need to fulfill exercise, but you don't want to give them loads of that fizzy energy or fast release energy. So your feeds like Horse Care Ultra, your Care Mash, and then if they need a little bit more, but you don't want to go too far up, you can go Horse Care 10 or Horse Care 14. So really, for your younger horses, I would be looking at staying within the care range, so you can have that low starch, high fiber, and kind of control the temperament side of things, because it's a lot to take in for younger horses, but they do need that support from a nutritional perspective, because it's a lot to ask of them as well. They are learning as they go, and building as they go. For your first competition, it again, not for all, every individual is different, but for competition, your younger horses might potentially need something like the NutriCam gel. So you can give a syringe, a couple of hours before your event, and you're then going to get that more focused energy. You're not putting them to sleep. It's not a sedative. It's more about the focus. And again, you want them to take everything in and do it properly, like you've obviously built up in your training. So when it comes to your first event, then you want to make sure that you're not kind of blowing it all out of the water.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're talking about moving up and down. Like you can mix within the care range. I think that is something that's also a benefit, is that you can be feeding your ultra, but for some people, the ultra, if you've got a horse that can be a little bit on the laid back side, you can mix in a little bit of the horse 10, or you can mix and match within the feeds, can't you?
Well, that's it. Like as a range, they all have our care package, so they all have all the extra support and everything they need in there. But all the ingredients are very similar. There's slight differences, obviously, as they change in energy content, but really they're very similar in their composition. So if you do want a little bit more energy, you can add in a bit of one without having to change your whole entire daily feeding regime. So if you want that little bit extra, add in a bit of your horse care 10 with your ultra, or add in a bit of your horse care 14 with your ultra. Either way, you can mix and match, and it's safe to do so. Like you're not going beyond beyond anything that's safe by using a few different feeds within the one range.
Perfect. So with winter training, like obviously there's plenty of horses that will be doing more dressage over the winter than they probably would do at lots of other times of the year. How do you make sure that you're getting that balance right of supporting your horse from a nutritional perspective, but then also taking into account that they're doing this on cold nights and potentially going back into a stable for the evening afterwards, or you don't have the flexibility you have during the summer? Is there considerations to be made on that front?
Yeah, I think like a lot of that is management rather than, you wouldn't be changing your feed just because you've done a harder session tonight than any other night. What is beneficial is, say, if you've done a really hard session and they're going straight back into their box, first of all, you want to make sure that they're rugged appropriately to make sure they're maintaining body heat and keeping warm and all the rest. Forage has a big impact on body heat and making sure that they keep themselves tipping along. But something like the care mash is absolutely perfect for a winter's evening. They're after having a tough session. It can help with hydration, help with recovery, and they've got everything in there to fulfill what they've just used in exercise. So something like that over the winter would be absolutely ideal after a tough session.
Because that is the thing, isn't it? That it does go beyond just the feed. There is that hydration element. There's so many horses that might be funny about drinking, and it's encouraging them to get
Yeah.
that water into them, the hydration. There's a level of electrolytes that's needed for them to be able to recover. All those elements are to be factored in. And like the value of forage, I feel like people expect us to go straight to feed when they ask us questions. But
Yeah.
time and time again, yourself and all of the technical team, the first things that you are talking about is nearly always forage.
Yeah, forage is so important, and especially in the winter. Like what we tend to do as horse people is the minute we get cold, we're like, "Oh God, put another rug on the horse. They're cold." They don't have the same mechanisms as we do, and they maintain heat a lot better than we do because of um the surface area of their body in comparison, and the ratio. So really, what you're better off doing than adding an extra rug is giving them an extra slice of hay, and they'll keep themselves warm that way. Because there's so much heat produced when they ferment the hay in the hindgut. So, like, don't underestimate forage. I know we say it all the time. People are probably sick to the back teeth of hearing me say don't underestimate forage, but it is so important. And just because it's a couple of degrees colder one night than the other, you don't need to have a third rug. Just give them an extra slice of hay. Obviously, if there's drastic changes in temperature, rugging needs to be thought about. I'm not disputing that, but don't panic, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. On to the idea of kind of those issues that we're all a little bit afraid of coming into the winter. So, the first one on my list to ask you about is we do hear a lot about winter colic, and
Yeah.
I suppose what is it that we're worrying about, and is there steps that we can take to try and prevent it or to try and reduce our risk?
Yeah. So it is something that we should be thinking about and we should be cautious of. Really, with reduced temperatures, reduced exercise, changes in feed often, um, reduced water intake, all of these things can contribute towards the risk of colic. Um, and really, it's a matter of taking all of those things into consideration to try and mitigate those risks. So when temperatures drop, horses don't have the same stimulation to drink. So that's why they will not drink as much in the winter. Also, if the water itself is very cold, they don't tend to want to drink as much. So it's kind of management things all the time. So trying to make sure that the water isn't too cold. If we get a really sharp winter and there's freezing and ice and all the rest, it's going out first thing in the morning to check those water troughs, because if that's frozen over, obviously they have no access to water. That's a huge risk for colic. They need to be Horses are trickle feeders, we say it all the time. They need things gradually moving through the gut constantly, so they need access to something. If they're out in the fields and there's very little, again, if we're in a real cold spell I'm talking about, and there's, like, not a lot of grass, they'll not be eating a whole lot, there'll not be a whole lot moving through their system. So in that case, they should be getting access to hay or haylage as well to make sure that they're having something move through the gut all the time. Because if they've had nothing overnight, they've had no water, and then first thing in the morning they get a big bucket of hard feed, you're asking for problems. So it's making sure that all of those things can be aligned. So make sure they have plenty of access to clean, fresh water that isn't too cold. Make sure they have access to forage. Don't overfeed your hard feed. Split it into smaller meals, like we always say. But especially if in the winter those things have happened, the last thing they need is a big bucket of hard feed straight away. And then also turn out exercise, keeping them moving, all that kind of stuff is it does play its role as well. So it's more management than worrying about what bag of feed you're given. It's taking all of the things into consideration and kind of trying to mitigate the risks as much as possible.
And then the next thing is frosty grass. We hear a lot of warnings about frosty grass and not turning your horse out too soon. Again, there is a great cohort of Connemara's that are eventing really successfully,
Yeah.
but they are particularly at risk of things like laminitis. So then,
There.
I suppose, what is the danger of frosty grass? Why are we all afraid of it?
So really what happens is in the mornings when the grass is frosty, the fructans are higher. So that's a type of sugar. So sugars are higher when you've got frosty grass. That's what we're afraid of. Anything associated with laminitis, EMS, any metabolic conditions, you want a low sugar, low starch diet. So if you're then on, say you're feeding something like Ultra because you're afraid of laminitis and you want a low starch diet, but then you're turning them out in the morning when the sugars are really high in the grass, if it's frosty, that is obviously, then you're kind of counteracting your hard work. So what you need to do is wait until the sharpness of that frost wears off. It's a bit more reasonable temperatures. Like, it depends on what kind of winter we get. Obviously, we have to take it as it comes. But wait a couple of hours anyway, at least until it's dewy, and then turn them out. So if your horses don't have, if you're not particularly worried about things like laminitis and that, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to cause huge risks. But if you have these Connemara, cobs, whatever, that they're all at higher risk of things like laminitis, as we know, you're going to want to take precaution, because the last thing you need is a bout of laminitis. So just wait those extra couple of hours when the sugars are lower in the grass, and then you're managing from all perspectives, because you're buying your bag of Ultra and then counteracting it if you turn them out early with frosty grass.
And then there's lots and lots of older horses and ponies that are going out eventing. Is there particular things you can do over the winter to help them to help make sure they're feeling their best come springtime?
Yeah, I think like the main thing for older or younger, even for that matter, is nourishing throughout winter and not worrying about really you have to look at the individual. So if they're a good doer or a poor doer, you still have to nourish them. So if they're a good doer, like we were saying earlier, you'd give them the balance or whatever without giving the calories. If they're older, they tend to kinda generally from what I see is in the winter, they'll tend to drop off in weight a little bit more. They'll tend to lose weight a little bit easier or quicker in the winter than what you would have liked. So with those older horses, it's often about giving them that little bit extra in the winter to counteract what you think is already gonna happen. You're kind of doing it to preempt them losing the weight. If you know your own horse and you know that they tend to do that in the winter and they're a bit older and that's the way it goes, then really what I would be doing is looking at the likes of the care mash because it's perfectly suitable for older horses because older horses are more prone to metabolic conditions. So you have lower starch formulation. It's laminitis friendly, EMS friendly, gastric ulcer friendly, all of those things, while also supporting everything else from a nourishment perspective because it is a complete feed. Um, Also, if you do have it depends how old, but if you have older horses that have, poor dentition and they're not chewing their feed properly, obviously a mash is ideal, but you want a mash that's low in starch. So the care mash for older horses is really gonna help because you're gonna maintain condition, you're gonna keep that low starch diet, and in a mash format that they're often not gonna turn their nose up to. So that's something I would really consider for any older horses in winter.
Perfect. And then to wrap up, how important is it to make sure that we are going back to those basics and getting the basics right? I know forage has come up a number of times. Even water and how much water your horse is drinking, keeping track of all that. Like, how important is it to make sure those basics are covered before you start investing into all these extras?
It's so important because if you're going out and spending however much money on hard feed and all these different supplements and everything else, but you're not taking into consideration the basic management protocols, you're really doing yourself a disservice because you're spending all this money, but you're causing problems in the background because if you don't have plenty of forage, your gut is unbalanced regardless of any other issues. You don't have to have ulcers for your gut to be unbalanced. If you don't have plenty of forage, it will be. Um, if you're not having a look at your horses in terms of body condition scoring and looking at them to see how they're getting on, how they're thriving, what they might be lacking or needing, then it's hard to make a plan because you don't know where you're at. So you need to look at things like that. Water cannot be um underestimated, especially when you take into consideration the things like colic and the risk of colic being higher in the winter. So um forage, take a look at them, make sure they've clean water, um, appropriate turnout and stabling. Everyone's practical situation is going to be different, but um, making sure that you're having a think about how that's going to work for you practically and what you need to take into consideration because of your turnout scenario. And then you match up your hard feed, considering all those other things first. So take all your management things into perspective first, and then you decide, okay, I'm going to need some more calories in the winter because he's going to lose weight. So I'll go for ultra or I'll go for care match. Or, okay, I've had a look at him. He's really fat. I need to kind of control that over the winter before I get him back into work and he's too heavy to do any exercise. Okay, I'm going to make a plan now and he's going to be on hay and grow care balancer. Um, Obviously, we've mentioned before, but on the Red Mills and the Foran website, we have an Ask the Expert section. If you're not sure of how to match up your hard feed given your specific scenario, send us in a query. One of the team will get back to you and we'll make a plan appropriately. But don't don't sit there and panic and not wonder, am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? You may have made a perfect plan, but you might just need a bit of reassurance to ring us up and be like, here, is this right? Am I doing the right thing? 9 times out of 10, we're like, yeah, you're bang on. But sometimes people just need that extra bit of reassurance. Or if you haven't a clue, grand, still give us a ring or send in the email query or whatever. And we can help you decide what might be appropriate for you and for your horse and for what you want come springtime or come January or whatever, whenever you're starting your program.
I'd absolutely echo that about the asking the experts. We had 2 minutes while we were waiting for this to start, and I was like, Erin, I have a question. It's very much, it's a fantastic resource to be able to have, to be able to then ask any of those questions. And genuinely, there's no question that's silly. The amount of times, like, working for Red Mills, I'm still texting the girls going, I have a thought and I think I'm right. And it is so reassuring just to get a yes, you're fine, keep going on what you're doing. So that definitely is something that's very, very worthwhile. Erin, thank you so much for this evening. Thanks again as well to Eventing Ireland. It's always great to have a partnership with Eventing Ireland. We've had our OBP League to great success this year, and it's always, I love the OBP leagues because I love seeing everybody getting to compete in the same league, and the professionals getting challenged by all levels of the sport. So it's always a great league to be able to support. So yeah, that's us for this evening. Thank you very much, and Erin, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll chat to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.